Welcome to A History of Nature for 2022. My name is John Wilkins and I'll be your course coordinator and your lecturer, and I will tutor along with Tori Tedeschi, who will be doing the other tutes. At this stage, at the time of recording, I'm not entirely sure if there will be other tutors and other tutes. Time will tell. In any case, g'day. So this is an intensive subject, which means that you've basically got 20 hours of lectures and an hour each day of tutorials, making up for 30 hours all up. This is going to take a lot of effort on your part, and I do apologize for this, but it's the nature of an intensive. If you've got problems, do not hesitate to contact your tutor. And if you have problems with the subject as a whole, such as accessing these recordings, don't hesitate to contact me directly. All of the details are in the downloadable subject guide, which you'll find on the LMS. Pretty much everything's on the LMS. So you might be wondering, what on earth are we looking at in A History of Nature? What's it about? So the question of what counts as nature, natural, the natures of things, human involvement in nature, humans being part of nature, all of these sorts of ideas go back around about 2,500 years to what is sometimes called the beginning of naturalism, which is a very Western-centric view, but this is in fact a Western-centric subject. If I'd had the time, I would have loved to carry on with questions of East Asian, indigenous and other traditional views of nature, which is typically regarded as earth and contrasted with heaven in most of these circumstances. But we're just constricting ourselves to the Western tradition, in large part because the things that the Western view of nature brought to us is, well, the explanation in science, in biology in particular, the roots of environmentalism and ecology, and the philosophy of humans as part of or not as part of nature. This is influential beyond the Western tradition, in large part because of the overwhelming, what's the word? Hegemony is a word sometimes used, the overwhelming dominance of Western thought up until this point in history. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the histories of the ideas, hence A History of Nature. Now, just because a term was developed in a particular context doesn't make it either right or wrong, or important or unimportant. And I want you to understand in particular how you're not going to deal with questions of the importance of these ideas apart from the historical process. I'm not trying to sell you anything, but I do want you to avoid the genealogical, the genetic fallacy, which assumes that the origin of an idea either taints it or establishes it. That's not how we're going to work on this. Alrighty, so this is a history subject. We're going to be looking at historical trends. We're going to be looking at how ideas like nature, natural history developed into biology, ecology. We're going to look at how ideas play a role in social and political ideas of nature. We're going to look at conservation, climate change, human values of nature, and so forth. And in particular, something that's dear to my heart, largely because I was trained as a philosopher, the philosophical development of these ideas. So it's not like these ideas just sit there in some sort of eternal realm. They are human creations, and they are the result of our interaction with nature. And so we'll be looking at how our ideas have changed as our ways of interacting with the world have changed. Okay, so that's enough of an intro. Let's have a look at the timetable. Now, at the time of recording, I'm not entirely sure what's going to be happening, whether I'm going to be delivering the lectures live in a theatre, or whether it's all going to be on Zoom. But let's assume that it's going to be live. So what will be happening is these recordings will be made available on the LMS prior to 10 a.m. on each day. And if it's in the lecture theatre, then I will be in the lecture theatre, and we will present it via Zoom with the lecture running in the background and people chatting on the chat panel or asking questions in the course of it. Now, you are invited and encouraged to ask questions, but the first lecture is going to be pre-packed. So at the end of the first 50 minutes, we'll have a 10-minute break and then a shorter lecture, I hope. You'll find out that I have trouble keeping quiet. But also in the tutorials, you can ask questions, you can argue your own perspective, you can question anything that's said, challenge it. Nobody will be marked down for disagreeing with me or the other tutors, and nobody will be marked up for agreeing with us, right? This is about you understanding the material and taking a critical approach to these questions, okay? There's no orthodoxy, as is often the case in philosophy and almost always the case in history. Now, it's really important you do the readings. What I've tried to do with the selection of readings is to give you a required reading, one required reading, and a number of recommended readings. Now, some weeks you won't need to do the recommended readings, so if you're pressed and need to catch up on stuff, don't panic about it. But in at least one situation, there will be a couple of historical readings, that is, historical source texts. Although I've got here all subsequent readings will contain at least one primary historical source text, that's a text from the historical period being discussed. I've sort of changed that a little bit, so now the required readings will always be secondary sources, and the primary sources, that is the historical sources, will always be recommended. But in one case you will be required to do that, and that's Voyages of Discovery, which is day 3. Now, if you don't do the readings before the tutorial, you'll probably not understand that topic. If you don't watch the lectures, you won't understand the topic. So you've got to do them both, and you've got to do them together. If you come to the tutorial with questions, then you are going to end up understanding a lot more about the readings, a lot more about the ideas. If you don't, then even though you might find it really easy for you to, speak in tutorials on the spur of the moment, you're only going to be sharing ignorance. And I want to say this is a general principle of study. If you're confused, the likelihood is most of your classmates, if not all of them, are also confused. So if you ask a question, then you are helping everyone, not just me, but all of your co-students as well as yourself. Now, I think it's a good idea for you to take a position and try to argue for it, even if you're not sure about that, because I always found that defending a view, whether or not you are well established with that view, but defending a view is the doing of philosophy, and you learn more by doing than by listening. Okay, all the assessment is written in the course guide. In fact, everything is written in the course guide. it's common for lecturers to make the point that it's written in the what's sometimes called the curriculum. We at Melbourne call it the course guide, and that most of your questions can be answered by looking at that. So please check the course guide, check the website. I've tried to make it as consistent as possible, and if you can't find an answer that way, then you can ask. Now, the assessment consists of 4 written pieces, 2 take-home exams. They'll be done online. You have 24 hours to do them, and it's a non-teaching day. The first one will be next Wednesday, and the second one will be the Wednesday following. You have a document exercise, and we'll talk about that more later, and you have a final essay. Okay? All the information is, surprisingly, in the course guide. All right, so let's get going. This part of the day is going to be talking about the transformation from us being stone tool using hunter foraging societies through to agriculture and cities. This is quite literally prehistoric, because history is generally regarded as that period of human experience where we have written records of some kind. And of course, prior to the invention of writing, which was sometime around about 2000 before the Common Era, maybe a little earlier, you don't have written records, and you certainly don't have narratives. You don't have people's diaries or anything like that. So this bit, there are no primary sources. So let's have a look. Human origins. We tend to be very focused on our ancestors. It seems to be a human universal. And our ancestors, our ancestry, goes back around about, well, I want to say about 6 million years, and us as a species is generally regarded as somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 or 250,000 years. Let's say 250,000 years. Now, that's not very long. The whole of human history and prehistory would be basically a minute fraction of the history of life on Earth, and an even more minute fraction of the history of the universe itself, as far as we understand it. But we seem to have a few ideas which are common to those who work in the area. Although I do have a friend who says that we seem to think that the idea is we get a new fossil, we name a new species, and we've somehow found what happened in the past. And he says the answer to everything is not always a new species name. Just bear that in mind. So in what follows, I'm going to give you a very brief summary of the relationship of human beings with nature or the environment from the appearance of modern Homo sapiens, which I said 200,000 or so years ago, through to the development of the first urban complex societies around about 8,000 years ago. Now, just stop and think for a minute. 8,000 years is nothing. Okay? It seems like a very long time, but it depends who you ask. To a geologist, 8,000 years barely registers in the geological record. To astronomers, 8,000 years is about the limit of the accuracy of their predictions of orbital mechanics in the solar system. But the solar system itself is something along the lines of about 6 billion years old, etc., etc. So terms like sudden or long or gradual or episodic, these things are relative to the interests that you have, the theoretical ideas and the techniques you've got. Okay. So a modern picture of the origins of modern Homo sapiens, and the development of agriculture, the emergence of early civilizations, and the role of nature and culture themselves have played in the way they've played in those developments has a history of its own, and it's inextricably linked to our conceptions of and attitudes towards nature. In many ways, our modern thinking regarding the relationship between nature and human origins, human society, begins in the mid-19th century, and even more specifically with the year 1859. There are good reasons to select 1859. Obviously, the publication of The Origin of Species was a major event in the way we think about nature, and arguably it would be entirely impossible for us to scientifically understand the natural world and life without appealing to the ideas in that book. We'll certainly be looking at the influence of Darwin and Darwinian thinking on our understanding of nature in later lectures. But it's an important year in the history of science for another reason, and one that challenged our understanding of the history of our place in the natural world much more quickly than The Origin of Species. The Origin of Species was debated for a decade or more, but this was the demonstration in northwestern Europe, mostly in France and England, that the human story does not extend back only some half a dozen millennia, as received opinion of those days would have had it, based on the Bible. Instead, it showed that people of one sort or another had actually existed far back in geological history, well before the Earth's landscape had assumed its present form, and this became known as the Antiquity of Man controversy in the 19th century. Around 1842, 20 years earlier, Frenchman Jacques Bouchier de Perthes began examining the quarries of Abbeville in the Somme River Valley. Bouchier de Perthes began collecting stone tools called hand axes, which quarrymen in the area had been recovering from geological strata that also contained fossil elephants and rhinoceroses. By 1847, he completed the first edition of his Celtic and antediluvial antiquities. Now, antediluvial means before the flood. Remember, many people thought that if the Bible wasn't accurate in terms of the actual scale of history, it was accurate in terms of the sequence, and there was still a belief, very widespread, that there had been, if not a global flood, then a major flood, which was recorded in the Bible. So Bouchier de Perthes argued that he'd found proof of human antiquity, that is, human beings had existed in a very remote geological period indeed, and for a decade his arguments were not believed. But in 1859, two English geologists, Joseph Prestwich and John Evans, visited Bouchier de Perthes, took photos, and his scientific fortunes began changing. They returned to London and convinced the Royal Society with their photos, with their sketches and so forth. And this story is given sometime in the history of every history of archaeology. Today we know that the tools, which we now call the Acheulean hand axes, were at least 500,000 years old and were probably used by Homo erectus. It was Bouchier de Perthes' discoveries that firmly established what we now call the Paleolithic era, or the Old Stone Age. And this was a term coined in 1865 by English naturalist John Lubbock in his book Prehistoric Times. Lubbock also coined the term the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age era. Thus, since the mid-19th century, it's been common to divide human history, or prehistory if you will, into two main periods: the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. The basic difference between the two is largely based on the subsistence technique, that is to say, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Now, The most striking change during the Paleolithic period is the spread of modern humans out of Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago. The ecological relationship we have with nature at this point is extensive. That is to say, we are just part of this process of gathering food and hunting and so forth, rather than intensive. That is, we are not exploiting every resource in a region or in a territory. We are exploiting only the food sources that are available seasonally and so forth. Some people believe that art, symbolic thinking, language are thought to originate with modern humans around about 150,000 to 200,000 years before present. But that's always been under challenge and is continually under challenge. What we do know is that language and culture accelerated technological change. Jared Diamond, in a book that I find annoyingly interesting but probably false, called Guns, Germs and Steel, argued there was a great leap forward from non-symbolic to symbolic thinking. I actually think that's faintly absurd, so I say no. But this period, the Paleolithic, was around 95% of our time on Earth. It's also the era we know the least about. So we'll have to discuss the different sorts of evidence that we are looking at when we think about Paleolithic eras and diets and so forth. The fact is, we know very little indeed. Right. From both genetic and fossil evidence, it's pretty obvious that humans did appear about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa, and that Homo sapiens left Africa and interbred with Neanderthals in the Middle East and Denisovans in Asia, as they spread through the world. Now, the interesting thing here is that's not the time that humans first found their way out of Africa. Homo erectus and various others, including Homo floresiensis and the so-called Denisovans, who haven't yet got a proper name, although they're generally referred to as Altai species. And the Neanderthals, obviously, and their predecessors, probably Homo ergaster. These species, Homo heidelbergensis, these species coexisted with Homo sapiens for some time. And the three competing views, the out of Africa only, was very, very popular in the 80s and 90s, is now generally regarded as greatly oversimplified. The multi-regional hypothesis was put forward to say that human beings arose more or less simultaneously in Europe and Asia and Africa. But the reality seems to be more complex. There's been an ebb and flow between Africa and these other places for a long time, and there's been interbreeding with these other two species. So people who are of what we think of as Southeast Asian or Oceanic heritage, they have a certain percentage between, I think between about 4 and 6% of their genes come from the Denisovans. And all non-Africans have around 1 to 4% of Neanderthal genes, or Neanderthal. The TH in German is a T sound. This ancient DNA is still around and does account for some of the regional variations between different populations in the human species. So here's a better view that humans arose sometime in what's called the Rift Valley, which is circled there, as you can see on the map, and spread via the Middle East and possibly by boats into India, Arabia, the Malaysian archipelago, through Asia into Siberia, and from East Asia into North America, and then to South America. And recently we have discovered that there are some genetic connections between oceanic peoples and Amazonian indigenes. So obviously there's a lot of missing communication in the record. Okay, so by about 100,000 years before present, we'd managed to live in places like deserts and dense forests, which were ecotypes that no earlier hominins, that's our group of family of African great apes, had earlier occupied. And this means that there was something about the way we lived as hunter-gatherers, combined with our language, culture and technology, that allowed us to spread to nearly every single ecosystem on the planet, and to all continents except for Antarctica by about 15,000 years ago. So what about how humans conceived of nature at the time? Well, there's not a lot of written evidence because writing hadn't been invented, but what we do see is that there's some artistic behaviours in various places. The famous Blomberg Cave in South Africa has shells that are clearly for jewellery. The famous rock caves paintings in France, the Lascaux cave painting, which is, I think, around 70,000 years old, but is beaten by a number of cave paintings in the Arnhem Land and the area in the northwest of Australia. I think there are even a couple of older paintings in places like Taiwan, but I'm not sure. You'd have to look that up. Around about 12,500 years ago, something happened to human life behaviours. This was a period known as the interglacial. It was the period where the glaciers that covered most of the northern hemisphere were in retreat, and something began to occur in what was then a period, a place of great fecundity. Like it was very good for soils, good for animals, and as it turns out, good for human beings. And this happened in what is now known as the Stone Mountain area of Turkey. Now, it began with what looks like the domestication of dogs, followed by the domestication of cattle, sheep, goats, and various other animals. But as well, in the Near East, there was the beginnings, which we know from pack rat middens, the beginnings of harvesting of grains and the inadvertent sowing of these grains, which led eventually to the domestication of our first grain crops. So this is known as the Neolithic period, and it's been the focus of a lot of attention by scholars in the last century or so. So the Neolithic period begins around about 12 to 10,000 years. As I said, there's different things happening in different places. And it ended some 6,000 years ago when the first complex societies, which is another way of saying civilization, I'll get back to that term in a minute, began to emerge. Now, the term civilization often is used to denigrate indigenous societies as not being civilized. This was a very Eurocentric view that basically Western scholars imposed upon the prehistory of the rest of the world. So it's a very Eurocentric view. Nevertheless, the term civilization means citification. It's the beginnings of what in Latin is known as the civis, the city, or in Greek, the polis, from which we get politics, politician, police, polite, and all those sorts of pol terms. So let's have a look at how agriculture begins. And in order to do that, we need to have an understanding of what agriculture really is. It's been defined as a symbiotic relationship in which humans help favoured species reproduce in return for food and other services. Now that's deliberately quite general, so that it includes animals, plants, arguably fungi as well, and it basically means that humans cease to be passive in the growing of food and other services from the ecosystem, to becoming active. And so Chris Scurry has said that the creation of an artificial ecosystem in which selected species of plants and animals are cultivated and reared. So the point being that this is an ecological definition. It's something that we do in an ecosystem of our own devising. And that's a very interesting point. We'll come back to talking about niche construction down the track, which is a different way of looking at nature. All right, so is this revolutionary or evolutionary? People have talked about the agricultural revolution. This term was coined by an Australian prehistorian, Gordon Childe, in 1923. Childe thought the transition to agriculture was very rapid and that it diffused rapidly once it had completed. In other words, he was modelling the agricultural revolution on the industrial revolution. Now, this isn't quite what we think happened anymore. It looks like there's a long lead up to agriculture. It looks like its diffusion happened in historical terms fairly rapidly, but nevertheless it may have even occurred in a number of different places. Now, if it has done that, it's probably because of a climactic change that makes agriculture more efficient, a way of getting your food and other resources than the old style Paleolithic approach. So let's have a look at the early origins of agriculture. Now, as you can see here, between around about 10,000 years before the present and around about 5,000 in the Americas, we start to see humans doing this all around the globe. It happens in East Asia with millet, rice, foxnut. I have no idea what foxnut is, but I'm sure it's delicious. Emmer wheat and einkorn wheat in the Middle Eastern region that I was talking about before. African rice, pearl millet and sorghum in Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. In the Americas, we're seeing potato, quinoa, cotton, sweet potato, yam, arrowroot, common bean, maize. In other words, we're looking at multiple centres of domestication and the dates in which they occur over a relatively long period, about 6,000 years. So is that a revolution or an evolution? Again, as I said earlier, it depends on your scale. It depends on whether you're a prehistorian or a historian. for my money, this is very clearly an evolutionary process, and I'd like to expand upon that. So 5,000 years does seem like a long time. 6,000 years does seem like a long time. But remember, Homo sapiens have existed for somewhere around 200,000 years, and hominid ancestors before that. And so what we might say is that for a very, very small fraction, I think around about, I want to say around about 5% maximum of our history as a species, we have been agricultural. Nevertheless, once agriculture began in the ancient Near East, it diffused into Africa, into Asia, into Europe rather rapidly, and arguably we could say that the Eurasian and African centres of domestication are themselves the result of a diffusion of the idea of agriculture, maybe. But what's happening in the Americas is happening independently of what's happening in Eurasia and Africa. I'd just like to point out that there's a very clear domestication around about 7,000 years before the present in Papua New Guinea, and particularly in the highlands, and so it's very unlikely that they were influenced by what had happened in the ancient Near East 5,000 years earlier. So I think we've got at least 3 centres of domestication. By the way, this is a very good paper, or rather book. I'm not sure, it's a special issue of a journal. But anyway, I strongly recommend following Ofer Bar Yosef. He's very influential in this whole debate if you've got an interest. So why agriculture? What is it that makes agriculture worthwhile? In a now very famous article, The Original Affluent Society, published in 1972, Marshall Salins, who was a sociologist, challenged the popular notion of Paleolithic life as being a brutal fight for survival, or to quote Thomas Hobbes, a life that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers, or what is now called the foraging society or traditional society, shows that somewhere between 3 to 6 hours of work a day is enough for survival. This is work that is pretty well consistent across a range of different areas. For example, the San Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert live in a rather extreme environment, and yet that's about what they spend every day to get their food. I'll come back to it in a second. Who got the food? This is very important. But the same is true of hunter-gatherers in Papua New Guinea, in northern Australia, in South America. They don't spend a lot of time working, right? So scholars now generally agree that foragers of the Paleolithic enjoyed, at least much of the time, sufficient food supplies, adequate shelter, and shorter daily working hours than many adults do today. In fact, life may not have been better for the early peasant farmers. In some ways, it may have even been worse. The dense village life of peasant farming and the proximity to animals led to new diseases. Vermin and rubbish became common issues. Incidentally, this is when the very interesting relationship between domesticated cats and human beings is thought to have begun. It looks like farmers had major and severe famines. Skeletal evidence suggests that hunter-gatherers may have had frequent seasonal periods of hunger, but when a famine hit a farming population, it was devastating. Now, this view that agriculture is the cause of what we call sedentary lifestyles has been challenged. Klaus Schmidt, the late German archaeologist who began the excavations of Göbekli Tepe, which is in the stone mountains of southern Turkey, modern Turkey, he argued that this monumental building was not a domestic situation, but was in fact a ritual location, a bit like Stonehenge. And he noted that there was no evidence of agriculture at all, either there or in the surrounding areas. So temple building may have led to the use of farming in the surrounding areas, but it doesn't. Farming doesn't explain why you've got such a massive undertaking at a time when there are no complex societies. Now, this has been reinforced lately by the discovery of another site. See if I can find the name of it. Called Karahan Tepe. It's around about 35 kilometres to the south and east of Göbekli Tepe, and it's around about 1,000 to 1,500 years earlier. And there is no. It was a domestic site, and there is no evidence that there's been any agriculture at that time. So we've got some interesting debates going on. The consensus appears to be that, in fact, the conditions that were available because of climate change in Turkey led to it being a very rich environment capable of supporting a high population, even though people were not doing agriculture. And it may have been that this is why agriculture begins around this area. Most of the animals which have been domesticated come from that region of the world. Okay, so what are the advantages of farming? You're spending something on the order of 12 to 14 hours per day farming. Remember, 3 to 5 hours in foraging societies. You're not travelling around a territory in which you gather food. You have an intensive exploitation of the territory. This, by the way, also leads to sedentary settlements because people need to be near where they're working the fields, and that therefore gives rise to warrior classes and wars for territory and so forth. So that's something to bear in mind as well. But the main reason why farming was taken up and why it spread is because of child survival, fundamentally. Foraging societies, traditional societies, have a very high death rate of children under 5. Like a massive death rate, which is problematic because if the child survives past 5, and this means 5 years of good resources, then they're going to have a happy and healthy life. They'll be taller, they'll be stronger, they'll be better fed, but fewer children will get through. And this has a tendency to keep the foraging society's population levels down, right? It becomes very sparse. Whereas farming, you have more calories, you have food during hard winters, you have the ability to support a higher population, which means more people can work the soil and so forth. And it's a kind of feedback loop. Okay, you have population growth that leads to more agricultural productivity, leads to more population growth, etc., and you end up with a feedback loop. In fact, you don't really need most of that diagram. It's just population growth leading to agricultural productivity and back. The intensification that farming permitted spurred humans to intervene in the natural and physical environment as they never had before. Farmers cleared more land, planted more crops, pastured more animals. They irrigated it. They took control of and used water sources. Once people adapted to agriculture, there was really no turning back. They couldn't really move on. So here we are with in the post-agrarian societies, and we're looking at the beginning of urbanization. Now, the earliest urbanization happens in the Middle East. You can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see here, that's the area where agriculture begins, and this is the area where urbanization begins. It moves down here in what's called the Mesopotamian region, which is between two rivers, which is what Mesopotamian means. And those rivers were very fertile because they were floodplains. And so that's where you get the first cities, you get the first urban complex societies. Now, this influences Europe, yes, influences Crete, but it also influences what's happening in the Indus Valley. And there was trade across here quite early on. So you can see that there's a degree of cultural diffusion between these, but not in the Americas. This is where agriculture begins autonomously and then moves into the plains civilizations, and the Andean, we're not sure whether there was a diffusion, but the Andean also diffuses into other parts of South America. Now, the most conspicuous characteristic of complex societies was cities. They were centers of power, of manufacturing, and of creativity. Building and preserving them, however, required drastic alterations of the local environment to produce sufficient food, building materials, and sources of energy. So building materials and sources of energy, well, that means trees. So alterations included deforestation, irrigation, the building of canals, the draining of wetlands and swamplands, and so on. So the price of this intervention is high. Dense urban societies are deeply vulnerable to changes in weather, climate, disease conditions, we're seeing it today, wood supplies, and trade links to distant regions. After the appearance of complex societies, humans had to step up their efforts to manipulate and control their physical and natural environment. In fact, it seems clear that some societies were unable to surmount these issues and collapsed, possibly as a result of a combination of changing and shifting climates, but also perhaps due to environmental degradation and mismanagement. Okay. Now, following the rise of early agrarian civilization, the world population started growing at a faster rate than ever before. So I'm not sure of the actual figures, but it's estimated that before the agricultural revolution, there was something like 25 million humans on the planet. So the size and density of communities expanded, and networks of communication by land and sea became more extensive and sophisticated. And by 2250 BCE, notice I used BCE before the Common Era, there were about 8 cities in the world that had 30,000 or more inhabitants. By 1200 BCE, there were 16 cities. Now within these cities, people took up full-time specialized occupations and professions, which you couldn't have had in earlier traditional societies because everybody had to be able to do a little bit of everything. Now, these specialised occupations included artisans, merchants, soldiers, priests, and so forth. And rather than spending most of their time collecting, producing, or processing food, they began to establish institutions with which we are now familiar, such as religion, political control, and those sorts of bureaucracies. In the 1930s, Gordon Childe labelled this the urban revolution. He was very fond of revolutions, a direct outgrowth of what he previously termed the Neolithic evolution. Now, I'd just like you to have a little look here. Uruk appears to be the first city of which we know. This is in present-day Iraq, I think. After that, these other cities in the Mesopotamian region, you can see the rivers going up there, they were established, and from there on you started to get cities as far away as Egypt and Greece, India and China, and it grew from there. So this is the period around which we start to get a distinction between domesticated and wild. And Ian Hodder's book, The Domestication of Europe, is a very good introduction to this. He points out that the house becomes the central unit around the domos, around which agricultural life develops and spreads. And the wild consisted of the agrios. Agriculture is the cultivation of the wild. So Hodder's view is very structuralist, it's very generalized, but it gives us an indication of what's going on at this period. Something like this conception of a dichotomy between nature and culture, the wild and the domesticated, and therefore between the savage and the civilized, was further accentuated with the development of cities. We can imagine a further distinction was made between the city and its dense built environment surrounded by a wall, and the rural countryside, the site of agriculture, and beyond that the wild, the untamed, the undomesticated. In Romance languages, a Romance language is something that develops from a Roman origin. Any term denoting wild, sauvage in French for example, comes from silva, the Latin for forest, and refers probably to the great European forests that remained at the time of Roman expansion into Europe, which was subsequently cleared and domesticated, though in fact this was a continuation of process begun millennia before the Neolithic. Okay, I want to pause. The last bit of the lecture was sort of a summary of human history and the important transition from hunting and gathering in the Paleolithic to agriculture in the Neolithic that occurred in many parts of the world. But now I want to focus on some of the ideas that we've just encountered, right, about the divisions between nature and culture, savage and civilized, etc. In doing so, I'm going to be foreshadowing ideas we'll come across in later lectures. So, philosophically and ideologically, the framing of the distinction between foragers and farmers dates to classical antiquity, possibly earlier. They used to refer to a golden age in classical thought, and I'm going to come back to that in the next lecture. And we have a repeated idea of a golden age from which current society has degenerated. You'll find this in the Theogony of Hesiod, who we'll be looking at, and in Plato and in a number of other sources. The alternative view, expressed best in our current literature by the Roman poet Lucretius, and we're going to look at him, is the human past was one of hardship and animal-like savagery, out of which man had emerged, and I use the term man advisedly here, thanks to the development of things like fire and technology. In the 17th and 18th century, Thomas Hobbes and Jacques Rousseau established a view of what's called primitivism these days. There's romantic primitivism associated with Rousseau and hard primitivism associated with Hobbes. So in the 19th century, the romantic view of the noble savage, of innocent people, becomes linked with environmentalism. So this is foreshadowing something we're going to extensively discuss. Now, this is what Hobbes thought, the hard primitivist, right? In such a place, in such a condition, the state of nature, this is wild humans, as it were. There's no industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and no culture of the earth, that is cultivation, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which is what I quoted before. Now, the really interesting thing is, this is almost a better description of anarchy in a complex society. Generally, hunter-foragers are not that horrible. Rousseau, on the other hand, came up with the idea that there's humans basically good, and war only begins after man leaves the state of nature and enters society, where conflicts arise from private property. Now, Hobbes thought that the lack of private property was what made state of nature horrible. Rousseau thought the lack of private property was what made the state of nature a state to be desired. So the noble savage, which wasn't originated by Rousseau but by Dryden in English, and originated from the French explorer Le Cabots in 1609. It became associated with Rousseau largely because people writing these histories had read their Rousseau and had not read either Dryden or Le Cabots' views. So it's a stereotype to highlight problems faced by modern Europeans and pointed to a way of life in which these problems were absent. So here's an example of the Golden Age. Lewis Cranach the Elder was, among other things, the artist of the Reformation. So it's pretty clear from this that he was no prude, or he was prurient, one of the two. But this is how he saw the Golden Age. Notice that there's a wall surrounding this area, and yet there are animals living in it, lions and deer and so forth living together. So the ecologically noble savage debate of the 19th century, particularly centering on American Indians, that they preserved the earth and life on earth, begins here, right? A critique of this by a fellow called Paul Nedazdi is, I'll just read it out. Those who subscribe to what is termed the ecologically noble savage cast indigenous people as original conservationists, age-old stewards of the environment whose ecological wisdom and spiritual connections to the land can serve as an inspiration for those in industrial society to seek a new, more sustainable relationship with the environment. If we in industrial society would only heed their ancient teaching, the argument goes, indigenous peoples could lead us off the path to environmental destruction. Anyway, I won't read the rest, but you get the general drift. This will become important down the track. Critics say that this rehashed version of the noble savage reduces the complexities of modern indigenous life to a caricature. Archaeology, history and anthropology have demonstrated that indigenous people profoundly altered their environment. Fire, possible megafaunal extinctions in North America and Australia, and the fact that they, as we will discuss, would often create fish traps and so forth, such as we find at Bottom in Victoria and elsewhere in New South Wales. So when the impossible demands that are made of ecological nobility for indigenous peoples aren't met, Western environmentalists often judge them very harshly, right? And then often become openly hostile and sometimes deteriorate into racist vitriol and even violence. And there's a reason for that, and we'll find out later. But close to home, here's one. The Greens, on the one hand, wanting to save the dugong, the traditional indigenous people who hunt the dugong for meat, and there's a conflict here that was parodied in, I think it was The Australian, unsurprisingly, but nevertheless there is a problem here. Okay, so to summarise this lecture, we have these questions to consider in the tutorials. And the reason I'm asking this question, or animals and plants for that matter, the reason I'm asking this question is that our domesticated agricultural products have what look like some very specific adaptations to our needs. They are not the way they are in the wild. Let's take the banana as an example. All bananas sold today are the clonal version of what used to be a seed-bearing plant, that is a sexual plant. If you find a wild banana plant and cut it open, it's almost inedible. It's got seeds scattered through it. There's just enough starchy material to attract animals who hopefully swallow the seeds and then distribute them around in their excreta. Now, that happened somehow, and it probably happened deliberately, but whether or not somebody discovered how to create a clonal version of it, or it just happened accidentally and then was picked up and carried on, that's the whole question of domestication. How did this occur? It's not as if there was a master plan, for example. So our relationship with animals originally, and plants for that matter, was the same as any other large animal. They were either food sources, threats, or they just happened to coexist in your environment. We hunted some, we scavenged others. Our mode of life, we lived like most primates do in small troops, which were part of larger bands, and we were primarily foragers rather than hunters. By the way, in most human hunter-foraging societies that we know of directly, women do the collection, the foraging, and that's around about 80 to 95% of all the protein and food source that's used. So we tended in olden days to privilege the hunter because it was a masculine, a male activity in Western society and others. But in fact, the majority of food production has always been, as far as we can tell, that done by non-hunting, and in particular by women. All right, so we talked about the Neolithic evolution, but what we haven't talked about is how it occurred. All right, let's have a look at dogs, for example. Now, dogs are usually thought to be a subspecies of wolf, and that they have been domesticated at least twice, once in Central Asia and once in East Asia. The likelihood is, however, that domestic dogs, while they are definitely within the wolf family, could be seen as a species because all the canids, that is the dog-like animals, jackals, hyenas, those sorts of things, they do interbreed fairly widely across the group. There's no impediment to interbreeding. So whether we call it a species, Canis domesticus, or a subspecies, Canis lupus domesticus, is really a matter of specialist's choice. The case that I like the most is the red wolf, which is a hybrid of both the northern grey wolf, which is scattered throughout Eurasia and the Americas, particularly boreal environments, that is northern environments. Um, the these wolves have crossbred with coyotes, forming a species, if you like, or a hybrid, if you don't like, called the red wolf. And given that species are the focus of conservation actions around the world based on the American Endangered Species Act, the question is, should we preserve these, protect these the way we protect wolves and or coyotes? Anyway, getting back to our friend the dog. As I said, it looks like it's been domesticated twice, and then formed geographic variants, particularly the Southeast Asian singing dogs, which are spread throughout the Malaysian archipelago, including Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. These dogs don't bark; they howl in a particular way, and they were brought by Aboriginal migrants, as it were, around about 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. We're not entirely sure when, but they were introduced into Australia and they became dingoes. So, dual origin. Now, how do we get this to have happened? How did wolves end up becoming chihuahuas and pugs and French bulldogs and the like, as well as wolfhounds and bloodhounds and all these sorts of things? So, how do you get from a wolf to that? And the reigning view is that wolves would scavenge from human campsites. Wolves typically do not attack humans, largely because humans tend to travel in large packs and they have fire and pointy things. But if the wolves didn't threaten the humans left them alone. Now, humans would occasionally hunt, and they would throw their bones away, which is a source of bone marrow, which is a very nutritious source of food, particularly for a carnivore. And so they would sneak up, steal the bones, go away and eat them. The more human tolerant they were, the more food they got. The more food they got, the more they survived, reproduced, raised progeny to maturity. And so there was a process of inadvertent selection. Now, this wasn't artificial selection the way a breeder would do it. This was unintentional. It was a side effect. Once this happened, wolves became more tolerant of humans and even started to cooperate with them. So, how do we get there? Let's have a look at Belyaev's experiment for a hint. So this is based on foxes, not wolves. Foxes typically don't like human beings. They will avoid them. They will get aggressive if cornered. Nevertheless, their pelts, particularly silver foxes in Russia, were in high demand in the early part of the 20th century for coats. So there was a Soviet geneticist who was barred from research. His name was Dmitry Belyaev, for political reasons, which was, if you know about it, the Lysenkoist movement, which was anti-Mendelian genetics and basically a kind of Lamarckism and inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so Belyaev was sent to a breeding station in Siberia where they bred Russian silver foxes. So Belyaev started to feed and breed the individuals that weren't as afraid of their feeders and their trainers. He started this deliberate selection process, or as it's called, artificial selection process. and he, within 10 years, evolved dogs, or something very similar to dogs, from foxes. That is to say, they had floppy ears, they had coloration, they wagged their tail when they approached their feeders. They started to bark slightly. Foxes don't bark. So basically he ended up recreating what we now think was the inadvertent selection of wolves through a process of artificial selection. Now, there are critics. His breeding stock came from a Canadian site that had already bred for what was called affability. But nevertheless, a very good book by an evolutionary biologist, Lee Allen Dugatkin, and Ludmilla, I'm trying to remember what Ludmilla second name is. Anyway, I can't see it on the screen here. They wrote a book called How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, and if you're interested in this, I strongly recommend it. It's a good read. So Belyaev took these animals, bred from kits, which is the technical term for fox puppies, and their ears drooped, their tails began to wag, they started to bark, their coats started to show patterns. Now, why would that happen? And it turns out that there's a genetic linkage between that sort of affability behavior and these other traits. It's not that the having of floppy ears and wagging tails and so forth is what makes them affable, although it certainly helps humans to determine whether or not these are dangerous animals to approach. But because it's linked in the development process, they ended up with a very different body shape and behavior. And that was very definitely inadvertent selection with wolves. Now once they were domesticated, we did start to breed them, and we bred them for traits that we found useful, interesting, or amusing. Useful started first. So if you've ever dealt with any kind of a sheepdog, you'll know that if you've got kids and a sheepdog, your kids will be herded by the sheepdog. That's a behaviour for which there's been selection. There obviously had to have been behavioural inheritance and variation amongst the breeding stock, or at least those mutations had to have occurred later in order to be embedded within the population. So I want you to focus on inadvertent selection. It's natural selection by evolving together with human cultural desires. All right? Humans are not selecting for things, they're self-selecting, as it were. All right. So let's have a look at some of the animals and plants that have been domesticated. Here is a map showing the major animals, where they were first domesticated, and for example, the chicken is evolved from Southeast Asian jungle fowl. Obviously camels from different parts of the world, horses from the southwestern steppes of Central Asia, and they then are brought into other areas. Cattle from the European Bos taurus, which no longer exists because only the domesticated varieties are now given grazing area, and they died out probably 1,000 years ago or more. Anyway, so you can start to see that we've domesticated a certain number of animals, and sometimes we've done this by inadvertent selection, and sometimes we've done this by deliberate selection, by cultural selection, or as it's called in Darwin's Origin of Species, artificial selection. So here are the main ones. Goats and sheep are very closely related species. They're basically almost the same species, but geographical variations. They can interbreed. And around 11,000 years before the present, which would be around 9,000 BCE, they were taken out of the mountains as a way to get wool and milk. Cattle around 10,000 years before present, and pigs around 10,500 years before present. And as you can see, they then are taken throughout the region. Now it's very interesting to see that this is just to the north of the so-called Fertile Crescent, which runs from Egypt all the way up to what's now Iraq, and then down the Mesopotamian Valley. But that it also abuts the Çatalhöyük and the other sites that are pre-agrarian but are sort of large-scale projects. All right. Give you an idea. There's the wild sheep on the left there at the bottom, and there's the wild goat on the left at the top, and you can see the similarity between the two. They are definitely related. The mountain goat has been domesticated, which means it's got shorter horns, coloured pelts. Mouflons sheep, which is the original stock from which we get all of our sheep, you can see it also has a different coloration, and its horns are now more curly. So we've made some changes to these things for our purposes. Horses. I love horses. Not them themselves. They're scary as anything. I got on one once and I'd never do it again. But there are 8 or so species of zebras, asses and horses, and they have a range of different chromosome numbers. So the zebras have 32, the main domesticated horse has 64, so that's twice the number, and so on and so forth. You get all these different patterns. But what's really interesting is, despite the mismatch in chromosomes, there can be interbreeding between zebras and horses, zebras and asses, asses and horses, and so forth. And occasionally some of these are in fact fertile. So they're a really interesting group, very much like the canids in that respect. Ah yes, the cattle. So there's 2 types of cattle: zebu cattle, which are generally in India, and taurine cattle, which are generally in Europe and latterly in Africa. Now, they both are bred or domesticated from what was called the auroch, that's the Bos taurus, and they, as you can see, have quite distinct morphologies depending upon what it is you want from them. Milk cattle tend to be less stocky and hardy than meat cattle, and of course you get all sorts of variations in between. So the origins of our agriculture appear to be in this green, dark green area, and they spread out over the next 4,000 years to the rest of the whole Middle Eastern, Caucasian, Hellenic and Egyptian area, and from there to the rest of Europe and to India and places like that. Now let's have a quick look at wheat. On the left you see those little spindly things. They're emmer wheat. Emmer wheat has 2 or 3 seeds, which is not much, but because people would tend to harvest the ones that had more seeds, they would inadvertently drop those seeds, which would sprout. So next season, as they came back around, this is before agriculture, as they came back into the area, they would find more of these things which had more seeds in the head. And slowly, over time, that develops what we call wheat. Similar things happen to millet and barley and a bunch of other things in different places. So the modern wheat stalk, and this is even before the Green Revolution, the modern wheat stalk is massively modified. The seeds are more regular and they're easy to get out and so forth, from a process of inadvertent and then deliberate selection. Now, one thing I want to say about the Green Revolution is that in the early 70s, people were predicting a major population crash. Ecologist Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, I think around 1972, in which he said that by the 1980s there would be mass famines and population crashes. What he hadn't taken into account, however, was the work of a particular guy whose name I now can't remember, who bred wheat with hardier stalks so they could hold up bigger wheat heads, and as a result there would be more wheat and other such products available. Now, this isn't genetic modification, this is selective breeding, but it's a form of genetic modification in that while the genes were out there and not manufactured, they are being preferred, and that's another case of our selection. And so here you see a map where you've got all of the different fruits and vegetables and where they come from, and you'll have a look at the Americans' fruit and vegetables, and you'll see avocados, chili peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, all kinds of things which are not normally found in Eurasia or in Africa. So it's pretty clear that there's been an exchange, and I'll come back to that. All right, so a few more slides. This is a summary of how it happened. You can see the process there, and I want to make a distinction between inadvertent selection and artificial selection. Now, inadvertent selection is a process known as coevolution. The animals and plants changed. Humans didn't change a lot, but we did change. The most obvious one is that in regions that domesticated cattle and sheep to produce milk and cheese, a gene which is active in humans only when they are breastfeeding, which allows them to metabolize milk, became more widespread through a process of natural selection on the humans. And so lactose tolerance became more widespread in the European and eventually African and Middle Eastern populations. However, it has not happened so much in East and Southeast Asia, where lactose intolerance is much higher frequency than the rest of the world. So populations have been evolving. Moreover, Western milk and drinking populations are more resistant to diabetes. Why is that? Because lactose is a sugar, which means that if you're using milk, you are taking up a lot more sugar, and therefore you're at risk of developing diabetes. So that's why humans have evolved. People will occasionally say humans have stopped evolving. That's rubbish, by the way. Okay. Individually, however, the result of agriculture is longer work and shorter statures. During the peak of the agrarian age, the average height for a farmer was about 5'4" to 5'6", or I think about 1.5 meters. Now, in the modern era, it's around 6 feet to 6'2", or about 1.8 to 1.9 meters. Now, this is really interesting because skeletal remains of hunter-gatherers show that they too have very large skeletons and large body size, and they are generally fit, and the illnesses or diseases of the bone tend to be those of hard wear, that is running and so forth, and not diseases of metabolic sorts. And the farmers suffered individually, but the population size increased dramatically. Finally, coevolution is due to the inadvertent, that is unintended, effects of one species on another. Humans are a species, let's not forget it. Once we learned how to get the breeds we wanted, we could do it deliberately, and artificial selection began. Now, one of the things about selection is that it's not about being absolutely fit or strong or fast or vicious in an environment. It's about being relatively better at reproducing successfully than the other varieties that are in your species. So a population will change as a result of that. In wild environments, that change happens at the pace of ecological change. If you get climatological change, then varieties which are more able to flourish in that new environment will breed more than those that aren't. In artificial environments, this happens at the pace of the changes to cultural goals. Believe it or not, very few of our modern breeds were in existence in the 16th century. Right? So as our modern breeds of dogs, as our goals for domestic dogs have changed, so too have the dogs very rapidly, and that's purely because of our cultural and aesthetic goals. Okay, finally, we changed as a result of agriculture, from nomadic to sedentary, from stress-free long lives to lives of hard work. We changed what we could digest. We adapted to our domestic organisms behaviourally and biologically, and the final result of agriculture is widespread complex societies, or as we have been calling it, urbanisation. Okay, now I'm going to open the floor, either literally or figuratively, depending on whether I'm giving a live lecture, a live session here. I encourage you to ask questions, either in the chat or in the Zoom or in the room. Okay, thank you.